So imagine you're a pilgrim, someone on a search for something different. And the something different that you're searching for is insight into how education works. Now, you've had a lot of experience of education. You've been to school yourself. You might even be a teacher. You might be a lecturer. You might be working in the educational field. You know what it is to experience good lessons. You know what good media are. You know what good textbooks are. You know what good schools look like or bad schools look like, because this has been a part of your experience. But the problem is, even though you have that ordinary level of experience about what schooling is, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have insight into the deep informing principles of how education works. Now, those deep principles give you insight not only into what is at the heart of your own educational experiences, but it should give you insight into how education across the world works. Whether you're in the East, in China or Japan, whether you're in the West, in America, Europe, Finland, and in Africa, where massive things are going on in countries like Tanzania, in Kenya, in Ghana, and certainly in South Africa. And what I really want to do in this course and the book which I've written is to introduce you into what these basic underlying principles are of how education works, so that you can understand one of the most powerful forces in the world that we have as human beings to improve our lives and improve the world, and certainly to work with the massive threats which are currently facing our very existence on this planet. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to set up what I take to be 5 core theoretical tools which will help you to analyze any educational event in the world. And like the pilgrim, I hope you will break through from your everyday understanding of education into a world where you see the deep operating principles of how education works. Now, the first tool which I've actually got in front of us over here is what I call the state variable model. And there's various articulations of this in educational theory, one of the most prominent being Basil Bernstein. And what the model basically does is it basically says that you have to try and get at the key variables of how education works in terms of how curriculum works, of how pedagogy or teaching and learning works, and how assessment works. And at the heart of those variables, you have to try and simplify it by saying it can either work in this way or in that way, and then use that as a guide to understanding basic shapes and forms of education across the world. So, for example, in the diagram we have in front of us, we have a variable, selection, and what it can do is it can change its state. And in terms of Bernstein, it can change its state from either being a weak selection principle, which means that the teacher is very open to other forces and other people making suggestions about what should be in the lesson. Could listen to the parents, could listen to the principal, could listen to other teachers, could listen to the kids. And basically be in an open, friendly, intuitive, feeling out space where you try and work out what the next best thing is to do in the lesson. Now, you get other teachers who work very differently to this, and they'll say something like, hold on, I'm the expert, I know what's going on, I'm the one that's being employed, I'm the one that's studied, and therefore I'm going to be the person that actually decides what is the next thing that needs to be done, and I'm going to be in charge here. Now, that kind of a situation, you have a teacher working with a very strong selection principle, where they're insisting on the boundary between what should be in the lesson and what should not be in the lesson being very strong and guided by the teacher herself or himself. So what you can hear there is we're starting to work with a very basic analytical tool which gets at the variables of education and the states that they can vary between. And really, that first tool will be one which will enable us to analyze any and every educational process in the world. And I look forward to showing you how that works in the first detailed video, which will come after this introduction. Now, the second basic theoretical tool that we're working with is one that's going to go beyond curriculum and pedagogy and assessment, which gives you how education works, into the deep informing principles behind why we do what we do in education. So it's all well and good to say, well, you should have a strong selection principle or a weak selection principle in terms of education. But why are you actually doing it? What is the guiding heart, the beating heart, the warm blood behind the inspiration of what you're doing? Are you, for example, a person who feels that creativity is absolutely vital to how education works, and you should feel everything in education should be guided by that principle? Or are you someone who deeply respects tradition and feels that education should take us through all the lessons we've already learnt in life and make sure we don't make the same mistakes in the future? That tradition is hard won, hard fought for, and should be respected and not tossed away lightly. Now, you can hear in the way that we're working with this that there are really two competing sets of ordering principles behind how education should be, and they would dramatically affect how you actually do education. So the more creative you are, the more you'll tend towards one type of education, and the more traditional you are, the more you'll tend towards another kind of education. Now, it's more complicated than that, which we'll find out in the second video we do after this introduction, where we'll start to show you that when you think about different ordering principles, you have to also consider the fact that often they work together in very interesting ways, or they can come into conflict also in very interesting ways. So, for example, there's nothing stopping a deeply creative person being highly respectful of the traditions and saying that you first have to go through the traditions and learn everything about them and master them before you attempt to go into the transcendent creative state. And I think there's something to be said for that. And in the second video of the series, what we'll do is we'll systematically go through what these different informing principles of education are and how they operate in education. Now, the third tool that we're going to work with is a tool which I call Conceptual Integration. And basically, it's a foundational operation in any teaching act. And any teaching act really has to go through a situation where they have to take something which is already fairly well understood in the child's own existence, in the child's own mind, or in the student's own understanding. And then you have to combine it with something which the child doesn't yet understand. And you've got to operate between these two spaces. You've got to try and make sure that you take the child from one state to another state by making links between the two and pushing the child from a state of not knowing into a state of understanding. Now, the basic theoretical tool which helps you to understand how this works I call Conceptual Integration. And as you can see in front of you, what you really have is you have two what we call input spaces. And what happens is we start to look for links across those spaces where you start to make meaning and understanding. And really what I'd like to do with the third tool is provide you with the means to understand the heart of how the pedagogic act actually functions. Now, the fourth theoretical tool that we're going to work with is one which has a fair amount of undeserved controversy, I think, mainly because sometimes it's called hierarchy, and in a democratic and open society we tend to look down on hierarchy. So I'd prefer to use the word levels instead of hierarchy, and really what I want to provide over here are the tools to help you to understand how levels work in education. Now, levels are basic to education. You go from early grades to later grades. You go from simpler knowledge to more complex knowledge. You move out from a small contained space into a situation where slowly but surely you go out into the world. So you're continuously expanding or going to higher levels in terms of how education works. And what I want to do with the fourth tool is really get you to a position where you understand at its central operating mechanisms how this thing called levels actually works, because I take it to be one of the foundational mechanisms in education. And then the final theoretical tool which I'm going to work with and introduce you to is, it's simply change. We all understand what change is and it's in how it works, but really what we need to do is we need to try and provide the theoretical articulation of how change works. And to do that, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and show you how specific variables change over time, and how it is that we hold two things which are changing, or three things which are changing, or four things which are changing, and we hold them together and try and understand the different change processes happening at the same time. If we don't understand that, we land up in danger of getting a very static version of education, where what's currently going on is taken to be the necessary state of education. Whereas education, at its heart, is always about change. It's about changing the learner, it's about improving the school, it's about taking knowledge and pushing knowledge forward. So there we have the basics of the 5 tools which I want to work with. We're going to work with a variable state model to help you understand pedagogy, curriculum and assessment. We're going to work with the deep regulative principles behind how education works and why we do education in the first place. We're going to try and understand the heart of the mechanism of conceptual integration, where teachers are trying to work between two different things and make sure the kids actually understand it properly. We're going to make sure we understand how levels work in education and provide the theoretical principles of levels. And then finally, we're going to take a careful look at how change operates in education, so that we don't land up with a static model, we land up with a process model of education. And with those 5 tools, of course, the hope is that, like the pilgrim, you land up in a situation where you break through into a space where you're not just looking at your own educational experiences and the experiences of your local surroundings, but you've become able and interested in analyzing and understanding all the educational processes of the world.